Hi, and welcome to Old Guys Gentlemen Flex fountain pens. It's different than the first one. This is video number 2, and the first one I didn't insert flex, but that's what's happened. And today's episode will be kind of my journey into flex pens, and I will have a separate video to review each one of the pens I'll be showing you, plus others, and as I get more, I'll be showing them to you. So, what got me into pens? And there was a little bit of a story in the first video on this, but I want to try and explain a little bit better. I collect flipper pocket knives, and my tastes in knives have gotten better and better, or at least more expensive. And what I really like about these things are a few things. First of all, the way it looks, which is pretty important to me. This is actually called a Grimsmo Brother Knives Rask. But also the action of it is incredible. You can do everything one-handed. A nice quick flick open. A nice, I call it the sublime drop. and it's also really sharp. So there's like 3 things associated with this. And the guys who make this also have Instagram channel, I guess you'd call it. And they talk about the fountain pen of their choice, and it was a tactile turn gist, which I showed in the first video. And I've actually had that up for sale on eBay right now, and it'll be sold by the end of the day. And it had just a little bit of flex, and I thought, well, that's interesting. In other words, you can make a little bit of a line variation about it. So I ended up falling in love with flex fountain pens for the same kind of reason that I like these knives. They look really nice. There's something about the action associated with them. And functionally, they're very sharp. For instance, this is a Waterman Commander from the 1940s, early 1940s, and it looks pretty good. There are better looking ones than this, but this one looks pretty good to me, and it has a really nice flex on it, and it functions really well. So why flex? What's so important about that? Well, I wanted to improve my handwriting style, which is just awful. It's been awful my whole life. And I looked at all the different styles, and I don't like to have all the swirls, and you can get really fancy with the handwriting. There's copper plate, and I don't even remember all the ones, but I started focusing in on Spencerian, which was kind of a business handwriting style of the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I think modern day cursive is somewhat based on the Spencerian and another method called the Palmer. There are several different styles to it. You can get fancy. There's something called a lady's hand or a fancy Spencerian. And what I liked is kind of the medium hand. This is like an old letter that I made a copy of. Not a great copy, but you can kind of see that what's going on here is line variation. So for instance, the C, they were able to do line variation to create the shading there. And to me that just looks really nice, and I wanted to be able to write like that. People who are really into Spencerian will tell you you can't really do it correctly with a fountain pen. You need to have a nib pen, and a nib pen usually with an angle. A nib pen is usually like a wood stick that has a little extension on it, so that when you're pointing the stick down like this is often an angle, so that when you want to do that shading and you push down on the nib, it spreads the tines evenly. There are 2 tines here. If you just try to write this and pull down here hard, you might get some shading, but eventually you would end up pushing one time into another, and they would get misaligned, and it would screw up the look, the feel, the ink flow. So in order to write like this, I have to go around and, for instance, if I want to do that shading, I've got to come around like this so that the angle of the letter with the shading is such that I can pull straight down for that. So this is not the best paper, but that's how you can get the nice shading you want without screwing up the tines. And then when you go back to writing again, then I have to rotate it back. It's a little bit cumbersome compared to having a dip nib that will do all this for you. But what I want to be able to do is when I'm traveling, or just for the convenience of writing at home, or when I'm going out for coffee, I want to write something down, I want to use this kind of style. A dip nib requires that you have a separate bottle for it, separate setup, and everybody's going to turn around and look at you going, "Whoa, what are you doing? Can I see that?" And I'm not really into that. So that's how I got into that. I'm trying to eventually write like this. And so what I've been doing is selling all my regular pen nibs, the ones that some people would call nails, and then started to get these flex pens. And I'll go through some of them real quickly so you can kind of see what I did. Now this is better paper here. This is a pad Leuchtturm. It's a German pad. And let's get to a cleaner sheet. All right. So I think one of the first flex pens I got, I spent a fair amount of money in something that I probably should have gotten more experience in before I did, but I did it anyhow. And I got a Pilot Heritage 912 that a guy by the name of Modeshaw modified, and he made it flexier and finer. Basically set it up as a pen for Spencerian writing. So I'm not going to do a lot of Spencerian, maybe no Spencerian writing on this particular video, but I'll show you how flexy it is. So I'll do some horizontal lines. And when I first got this, these horizontal lines were thinner than this. And the reason for that is when I first got it, the first thing I noticed is I could not write with it. It was such a sharp point that even on some of the better papers I had, it would catch and then fling ink around. And in order, and the other problem is that when you spread the tines, you would get railroading, which it is not doing now because I fixed all that. Part of the fix for making sure that it wasn't catching on the paper and flinging is I polished it. And with the way I polished it, I lost some of the thickness. So maybe it was a triple X fine before, and now it's just an extra fine. But you can see here that as I do broader, putting more and more pressure on it, you can do really wide lines. That's a pretty big line variation. Some people like to So when I got this thing, there was no way I could do that. It would be spitting and sputtering, and I think I had to learn to use a better paper, a lighter hand, and better ink. None of my inks would work, and I was using Pilot inks and Waterman inks. I found out that there's a ink called Private Reserve Tanzanite. I think they call this the laxative ink of fountain pen inks, and it worked most of the time, but it also seemed to leave some sort of residue, or it kind of gummed up the nib a little bit. And then I started reading some more about this particular ink, and I stopped using that. So then the next thing I did is I went in and I got a paper clip. I just touched it to some laundry detergent soap, and then I opened this up, and I'd touch it in the soap. I'd knock any visible soap off, so there was just this very thin slime of soap on there. And then I stuck it in the converter and just kind of whipped it around a little bit and went to write it, and it worked great. But then sometimes I would do it and then ink would come pouring out of here, and other times I would do it and it'd be skipping, so I needed to find a better way to do that. There's a posting on the internet that I'll try and dig up and put on here so you can see it. Somebody spent a lot of time figuring out the best way to make the ink flow better in pens like these. And what it involves, soap is basically a wetting agent, or I think it's called a surfactant. But this particular guy talked about Kodak PhotoFlow 200. For $7.49, you can buy a lifetime supply of this stuff. So at first I tried using the drop method with a paper clip, and found out that it was way too much stuff. From reading this one article, he talks about how he develops I think a 0.1% solution that he adds to larger quantities of ink. I started going down that path and found out that I had to add a whole bunch of drops of that kind of solution, and it's this stuff diluted with distilled water. I found that the water seemed to be affecting the ink, that I would get nice wet drawing to begin with, and then it would give up. So I kind of went the other direction and started with a 50% solution and some drops, and I started working with some of these little ink canisters. I think this is close to 10 milliliters. And what I would do is I would put 5 milliliters in here. And long story short, what I found out is that a 25% solution of this in distilled water, and then take that and then put 2 drops of that into 5 milliliters of ink, would give me the perfect ink for a modern high flex pen. But this is kind of small, and I knew I'd be using this kind of stuff later, and I found out roughly how many milliliters is in a drop, and then equated that up to a full bottle, which I think is 50 milliliters. And for my particular thing, 25% solution of PhotoFlow equals 1 milliliter of that 25% solution in this ink. And this ink is what you'll see here on my modern pens, and it works great. It doesn't flow out. The color of the ink is fine. So that's how I solved that problem. And by the way, I think this is the best combination for the Model modified pens. For Christmas, I got a Platinum 3776 nib, and I think this is there's a 14 karat soft fine, and it does flex, but not as much. I haven't polished this one as much, so this one's a little bit finer. So the flexing amount is quite a bit less. I'm actually hitting the feed when I do it here. So I wasn't particularly happy with that one, but I was with the other. I was also curious, a lot of people had talked about the Soft Fine Falcon pen. I think this is Soft Fine. It has that really unique looking nib on it. I do not believe I put any, I did not put any of my wetting agent in here. Because it's not spreading too far, it's keeping up pretty well. The other interesting thing I did is, this is a very inexpensive pen. It's a, gotta look back, the Jinhao, Jinhao 159, and I pulled the existing nib out of there, and this is called a Comic G nib. It's a dip nib. Excuse me. It's a dip nib. You can buy a little box of these things pretty cheaply. And the feed, I took the existing feed, I believe, and I deepened the ink channel in it. And then to make, I was experimenting with making the flow a little bit better. And so I heated it and pressed it in, and I ended up kind of destroying the nib. So I bought some other nibs from, I think it's from nib.com, and it worked fine in this. I think I did deepen the feed some, and I ended up polishing the tip because it was pretty sharp again. But this one is the greatest flexor. A little difficult to write with, but this one's kind of fun to work on because everything's so cheap. So if you really mess it up, it's not a big deal. Now, when I first got this would sound more like start to hear a little bit now that I'm flexing it. But look at the look at that. And this has got my ink additive to it. It's pouring out the ink. So actually with this one, I might create another concoction of ink with just a little bit less. But then I was kind of curious about vintage pens, and what I found out is that vintage pens write with a bunch of flex without much effort. So for instance, right now they're mostly Watermans, and no special inks on this. Really pretty broad brush strokes, big line variation. Pretty cool. One of the best pens, but it's a little bit of a pain in the butt to write with, is this one, which is a Waterman 12, and it's an eyedropper pen. And I didn't know it when I got it. But one of the issues with this pen is when you hold this for a while, it'll heat this up, and that'll expand the air inside, and I'll be writing for a while, and all of a sudden, blop, a huge drop of ink will come out. And the solution to that is when you open up before you write, you hold it in your hand. Sometimes I rub my hands together so that they're particularly hot. So I'll speed through this, but I'm going to hold this in my hand for about 30 seconds. Very, very And that's pretty cool. So this simple little pen that's a drop feeder is one of my favorite ones. I don't know if I'm a big fan of the red swirl black hard rubber look to it, and even if I'm really careful holding this and warming it up, every now and then I'll get a drop come out of it, which if you do a bunch of writing and all of a sudden that happens, it's not a fun moment. This is the pen that I showed you earlier. This is the Waterman Commando pen with an interesting history. They made these for the beginning of World War II for the soldiers, and they came in different colors for the different services. All these Waterman pens write really well. Nice thin lines. One of the interesting things about this pen is it looks black, right? If you can see that. It's red. And I've gotten advice on the forums that says all the blacks are basically, from this era, are basically kind of a dark, really dark red. I got this somewhat recently. This is a wall. Excuse me, no, this is a Waterman, and I believe it's. Oh, this is the French one. This is really kind of cool. And I think it was made right before the war, because at some point glass became kind of at a premium. There is a glass cartridge in here. There we go. I'm not sure if I put ink in this one. No, you know what this is? This is leftover some. This is was a perfectly clean ink, clean water coming out, no staining, and let it sit around for a while. And a little bit of moisture in there worked its way down. So I can't really show you how that one writes, but it writes pretty well. This is a Waterman 52. Yeah, that one. That one's dry like it's supposed to be. The way you can tell whether they're going to flex much for you is you can kind of work this on your fingernail and see how much they spread. On a newer pen, you can do that and go, oh wow, look at all that spread, but then the feed won't keep up with it unless you do some of the tricks that I've been doing. But this definitely keeps up with it. Got an Esterbrook. And oh yeah, this is the Wall Esterbrook Model J. And I don't know if I filled this one up. No, I'm pretty sure that's left over from the cleaning. Oh yeah, the other two pens. Now these are cheaper pens, and I have not inked these up. They don't write as well. They don't flex as much. I think this is the Noodler's Ahab, and it's got this. The tine is split all the way down, which is different than normal nibs, and it does spread. Again, this is leftover cleaning fluid on it, but I guess maybe I can use to show you a little bit. Yeah. So it spreads just a little bit, but not that much. So I tend not to use that one. This is an interesting interesting pen that was really cheap. It's a Fountain Pen Revolution. I forget the name of the model number. But for an extra $3, you can get a flex nib on it. And let's see here. You see how the tine split goes almost all the way down. And it has some, there's no real ink in here right now. Well, maybe it's worthwhile. Because these things are made fairly cheaply, you can see how the ink has already worked its way down right to here. Makes me nervous about bringing this anywhere. And you have to press a lot firmer, but you can still get some good line variation on it for a really inexpensive pen. I forget what I paid for this, but it was probably under $10. So for a cheap pen, that's pretty good. And I think what I probably need to do is pull this out and somehow put some, I have some silicone grease. Someday, I am going to write like this with ease, and I'll be doing it with one of the multitude of flex pens I have. I don't even like to... like here's, everybody raves about the Lamy 2000. So for Christmas, Santa Claus brought me this, and it looks really neat, and it's a nice, dependable writer. But there's really very minimal flex to it, and so I guess I might stick this in my pocket. Because I know it's going to be relatively safe, but it's not fun for me to write with it. I like the feel of the bounce, and so anyhow, I guess I've droned on long enough. I bet some of you who are thinking about flex pens, there'll be some valuable stuff in there. So until next time, hope you got a little bit of value out of this, and talk to you in the next video.